Start Hour 9. Attempts at Reform. Late in the Trump administration, following the long-delayed Senate confirmation of Michael Pack as USAM Chief Executive Officer, CO, agency leadership rapidly initiated long overdue and necessary reforms, including security reforms repeatedly requested by the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, ODNI, that had been ignored by USAM leadership. Unfortunately, as was the case with the OTF, the Biden administration immediately reinstated personnel who had been fired for gross security violations, placing the agency back into its previously failed posture, one that poses a danger to national security. The firewall saga. The vital error in USAM's current organizational/cultural calculus is the agency's selective application of a journalistic firewall. The amorphous interpretation of a firewall shifts depending on which administration is in office and who is asking questions. Although a firewall should ensure journalistic independence, it has been used without formal regulation for decades in order to shirk legitimate oversight of everything from promoting adversaries' propaganda to ignoring journalistic safety. Often, the firewall is touted when journalists are either promoting anti-American propaganda that parrots adversarial regime talking points or promoting politically biased viewpoints in opposition to the VOA charter. Such weak oversight, alien to any other large media network or news organization, particularly one derivative of U.S. foreign policy and national security goals, was erroneously enshrined in a document known as the Firewall Regulation. The Firewall Regulation was entered into the Federal Register on the eve of the Senate confirmation of President Donald Trump's USAM CEO, Michael Pack. It was the quintessential midnight reg, designed to throttle the statutory and executive authority of the agency head. It stipulated that agency management, by standards unknown to most large broadcast companies, was forbidden from engaging in oversight and direction of content in any way, even false content. It ran counter to the law, including the Smith-Mundt Act, 22, and it was harmful to the agency itself and to the foreign policy and national security goals of the U.S. government. Even content that went well beyond fair and accurate reporting on U.S. domestic and political problems could not be reined in by front office leadership under the Firewall Regulation. Soon, VOA's White House correspondent was posting content highly critical of and personally insulting to the U.S. president, in contradiction of VOA's own journalistic standards, policies, and procedures. USAM career officials considered such content sacrosanct and bravely independent, journalistic content protected by the spirit of the Firewall Regulation, despite ample evidence to the contrary. Late in the Trump administration, USAM political leadership, following an intensive U.S. Department of Justice review, revoked the Firewall Regulation over the protests of journalistic organizations, none more vociferous than VOA itself. While the abuses of the Firewall Regulation are particularly disconcerting, they encompass just a fraction of similar overreaches of the agency's journalistic mission. Current and former USAM/VOA leadership who wanted to maintain virtually zero accountability and oversight waged a campaign of interference, resistance, and disinformation to stifle change at the agency. Perhaps not coincidentally, various media outlets with relationships to former and future USAM leadership published near-daily criticisms of Trump administration appointees and also of grantee organization leaders who were appointed by CEO Pack to implement long-overdue reforms. Agency mission failure. Currently, the USAM, by and large, is not fulfilling its mission, which remains so ill-defined and ambiguous that it enables the organization to go about its business largely unguided with little to no oversight. Rather than providing news and information in an accurate, reliable way that promotes and supports freedom and democracy, the agency is mismanaged, disorganized, ineffective, and rife with waste and redundancy. These shortfalls are either oriented toward, or directly contribute to, the agency's media organizations joining the mainstream media's anti-U.S. chorus and denigrating the American story, all in the name of so-called journalistic independence. Indeed, content during the Trump administration was rife with typical mainstream media talking points assailing the president and his staff. The few bright spots within VOA and the OCB are often stifled instead of supported. Top-level talent often leaves the agency or is met with obstacles rather than support. Opportunities for modernization and effective strategy are ignored, and wasteful spending and misallocation of resources are the norm in an environment in which nepotism is rampant and political gamesmanship protects bad actors. Amanda Bennett was confirmed as USAM CO in 2022 after 2 years of being blocked by several members of Congress. Legal advocacy organization America First Legal Foundation even wrote to President Joe Biden asking him to withdraw her nomination, 27 citing several severe national security failures while she was director of VOA. Her tenure as director during the Obama administration and her holdover into the beginning of the Trump administration was marred with operational failures, security failures, and credibility failures. Those failures are reportedly ongoing during her current tenure as CO. Necessary reforms. Security issues. The Office of Personnel Management and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence flagged severe security failures during 4 extensive investigations of the USAM, each conducted during a 10-year period between 2010 and 2020. Security personnel and former agency senior leadership ignored these issues and allowed them to persist. In brief, the USAM is vulnerable to exploitation by foreign spies. During the last 6 months of the Trump administration, known foreign intelligence operatives were removed from the OCB and RFE/RL. During the 10-year period between 2010 and 2020, both the OPM and the ODNI found that the USAM's Office of Security, under the Office of Management, had grossly ignored and flouted many of the federal government's most critical and long-standing information and personnel security protocols, regulations, and practices. During the investigative period, in which the findings were largely, if not wholly, ignored by agency senior leadership, over 1,500 USAM personnel, nearly 40% of its total workforce, were performing their Tier 3 and Tier 5 national security-sensitive positions with falsified and/or unauthorized suitability for employment determinations and with access to sensitive federal buildings and information systems. In many cases, records, including social security numbers, were falsified or replaced with notional placeholders, and fingerprints, in many dozens of cases, were never submitted to the Federal Bureau of Investigation for basic background investigations. By the time these issues were addressed by members of the Trump administration, more than 500 personnel with unauthorized access and clearances had left the USAM and rolled into other federal agencies with reciprocal clearance authorizations. Many others disappeared into U.S. society. As of January 2021, the USAM had not yet determined the whereabouts of these individuals. Sonal management, to which they were transferred in the final weeks of the Trump administration. Journalist security. Agency journalists, both on and off American soil, have faced danger, 35, yet their superiors have done little to protect them. Whistleblowers and Trump administration officials found that protection of USAM American and foreign journalists employed by USAM networks and grantee organizations was severely lacking. Against often significant resistance, political appointees forced action to enable broadcasters, who were under verified threats, to broadcast from remote locations while being protected by federal law enforcement officers. Likewise, political appointees met resistance from senior career officials when insisting that foreign-based journalists in high-risk countries make their locations known to the agency in the event they required rescue, extraction, or safe housing. Such safety measures, argued career officials, would somehow represent a violation of journalistic independence. With only rare exceptions, resistance to the most basic journalist safety measures was the knee-jerk response from USAM career officials. Wasting taxpayer dollars. The USAM's current operations, properly managed, can be conducted on less than $700 million per year. Prior to the arrival of President Donald Trump's appointees in June 2020, budgeting, financial responsibility, and spending totaled over $800 million per year, with virtually no oversight or supervision. Waste, unnecessary spending, nepotism for pet projects, redundant programs, and unnecessary hiring abounded. Consolidation and reduction of redundant services. Currently, the USAM funds numerous redundant services through its own offices, through Voice of America and the Office of Cuba Broadcasting, and through its grantees. For example, VOA has a Mandarin language service, but also funds redundant services through Radio Free Asia. VOA also has a Farsi language service that duplicates one funded through Radio Free Europe/Radio Liberty. Surplus services in the same languages are often unnecessary and counterproductive. Fiscal responsibility and transparency should return to the USAM, with consolidation being a cornerstone of the strategy. As noted previously, the Open Technology Fund duplicates activities that already existed at the USAM in the Office of Internet Freedom. Numerous career whistleblowers came forward to sound the alarm to President Trump's USAM political team about OTF's abuse and overreach. Its opaque, expensive, and unnecessary usurpation of an existing USAM office is an egregious example of government waste and illustrates the general disdain for U.S. taxpayers that is rife within this agency. Full reinstatement of OF would allow full agency and congressional oversight into how so-called internet freedom money is being spent. J-1 visa program abuses. Rather than use the appropriate I-visa intended for foreign journalists, the USAM uses the J-1 cultural exchange visas to allow foreign nationals to transition easily into jobs that American citizens with cultural and linguistic expertise could satisfy. The J-1 visa is intended for cultural and academic exchange programs, among others, none of which include journalism. Additionally, J-1 visas are meant for non-immigrant temporary exchanges. The USAM's J-1 visa holders often go on to apply for permanent residency, which violates the intention of this visa. Shortwave transmission upgrades and improvements. Non-web-based technologies that are proven and durable, such as shortwave radio transmission stations, have been grossly de-emphasized in budgeting in favor of newer web-based technologies. This move is dangerously short-sighted and puts the U.S. at a perilous strategic disadvantage in the event of a major conflict, particularly with Russia or China. There is great concern about the vulnerability of undersea cable trunks that make up the internet cloud. The vast majority of global internet traffic, 95%, is transmitted through these cables, including news transmissions and web-based content produced by the USAM's broadcast networks. While the robust and popular use of the internet is ideal during peacetime, during times of major conflict, widespread damage to the undersea cables that carry communications across the globe can reasonably be expected. Long-lasting power outages are also likely, such as those Ukraine experienced in the aftermath of Russia's 2022 invasion. The USAM's responsibility for the only U.S. global shortwave radio capability is of critical strategic importance if America is to carry its message to people seeking information and freedom within conflict zones. Shortwave technologies also make it possible to carry broadcasts in areas where internet traffic is severely restricted, as it is in many authoritarian states today. Organizational issues. Personnel. Personnel is one of the biggest concerns for the USAM and its grantees. Attracting talented staff who will stay and letting go of poorly performing personnel are hurdles. Additionally, whistleblowers have come forward with numerous credible allegations of illegal nepotism and improper hiring practices. Past agency leaders have ignored national security procedures when hiring and have failed to adequately vet staff. Government hiring policies and federal law must be followed, and serious policy changes must be implemented to end these practices. Relevant government entities. The White House. As an executive branch agency, the USAM ostensibly should report to the President and coordinate activities with the National Security Council, NSC, especially given the direct and implied national security aspects of the agency's messaging globally. However, there currently is no specific office in the White House or NSC liaison for the USAM. The original network, VOA, functioned under the Office of Coordinator of Information as early as 1941, the War Department's Office of War Information from 1942 to 1945, the State Department from 1945 to 1953, and the U.S. Information Agency from 1953 until the creation of the Independent Broadcasting Board of Governors in 1999. Although some oversight and management functions of the agency are provided by the State Department, the USAM otherwise has little connectivity to larger departments or agencies, and even less to the White House. With the dissolution of the U.S. Information Agency in 1999, the USAM has virtually been under its own supervision and guidance. The results have been dismal. The State Department. VOA was most effective before and during the Cold War when it was under the direct supervision and control of the War and State Departments, respectively. If VOA is not put in the direct chain of command under the NSC, serious consideration should be given to putting VOA under the direct supervision of the Office of Global Public Affairs at the Department of State. The Office of Global Public Affairs was formed during the Trump administration by consolidation of the State Department's Bureau of International Information Programs and Bureau of Global Public Affairs. Ensuring that taxpayer-funded TV, radio, and messaging tells America's story is imperative and should be coordinated with the existing foreign-language social media platforms at the State Department. Currently, VOA's foreign-language TV programming is unreliable in telling America's story, given its amorphous interpretation of its independence firewall and its waning adherence to certain provisions of the Smith-Mint Act depending on which political party is in office. The VOA firewall is meant to protect broadcasters from government interference with content. However, USAM staff have abused the firewall and used it as an offensive measure to block oversight. Additionally, the Smith-Mint Act stipulates that USAM services are meant to tell the American story abroad, never to domestic audiences, but the agency has used its taxpayer funding to promote partisan messaging in the U.S. One of the most egregious examples was when, in 2020, it bought ads on its foreign-language social media sites to disseminate a Biden campaign ad and targeted it to a major Muslim population in Michigan. Moreover, VOA often airs foreign adversaries' propaganda, which is antithetical to its congressionally mandated core mission. State Department oversight, or command, may be one way to ensure that VOA and the rest of the USAM returns and adheres to its original mission. Clear lines of command and communications between the USAM and an appropriate office of the National Security Council are also sorely lacking, as has been any reasonable accountability for USAM senior leadership and strategy. The State Department's Assistant Secretary for Global Public Affairs and Undersecretary for Diplomacy and Public Affairs should also be in the accountability loop for agency actions. While the U.S. Secretary of State technically has a seat on the board of the agency, it is a toothless seat that is often deferred to the Undersecretary and/or Assistant Secretaries noted above. This position should be relevant and directive when U.S. foreign policy and strategic communications are at stake. For example, the years-long delay in confirming the Trump-appointed CO left disastrous holdover leadership from the previous administration. Employing effective leadership, even in an acting capacity, while a new CO is awaiting Senate confirmation, is necessary to prevent a repeat of this behavior. Congress. The USAM receives its budget and mandates directly from Congress. Often, changes in major functions at the agency happen because of the lobbying efforts of a few connected individuals, often grantees lobbying for more funds and less accountability. Those changes can and do handcuff leadership from any meaningful oversight. An overhaul of the agency with review from Congress to modernize, streamline, and reduce waste must be done with congressional support, key non-governmental stakeholders, allies, and non-allies. These include industry groups, nonprofits, trade associations, foundations, and activist organizations. For example, America First Legal Foundation, 43 USAM Watch, 44 BBG USAM Watch, 45 and Whistleblower Protection Project. Conclusion. The USAM is a story of a lost opportunity both to help restore the world's confidence in the promise and ideals of America and to set a high mark for journalistic integrity and unbiased reporting. These two areas have suffered severely under 2 decades of USAM mismanagement and lack of oversight. Finding solutions to these problems and the restoration of the agency's networks must be the priorities of future agency leadership. To accomplish this, the USAM must be fully reformed top to bottom with congressional and White House support. The possibility of consolidating not only the agency's subparts, but bringing the entire agency under the supervision of the NSC, the State Department, or both would dramatically aid that reform. If the de facto aim of the agency simply remains to compete in foreign markets using anti-US talking points that parrot America's adversaries' propaganda, then this represents an unacceptable burden to the US taxpayer and a negative return on investment. In that case, the USAM should be defunded and disestablished. If, however, the agency can be reformed to become an effective tool, it would be one of the greatest tools in America's arsenal to tell America's story and promote freedom and democracy around the world. Authors note, the preparation of this chapter was a collective effort involving many individuals to whom thanks is owed. These individuals include, but are not limited to, Victoria Coates, Michael Pack, Frank Wicko, and several brave whistleblowers who prefer not to be named. Their efforts were integral to the chapter and are greatly appreciated. Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Every Republican president since Richard Nixon has tried to strip the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, CPB, of taxpayer funding. That is significant not just because it means that for half a century, Republican presidents have failed to accomplish what they set out to do, but also because Nixon was the first president in office when National Public Radio, NPR, and the Public Broadcasting Service, PBS, which the CPB funds, went on air. In other words, all Republican presidents have recognized that public funding of domestic broadcasts is a mistake. As a 35-year-old lawyer in the Nixon White House, one Antonin Scalia warned that conservatives were being confronted with a long-range problem of significant social consequences, that is, the development of a government-funded broadcast system similar to the BBC. All of which means that the next conservative president must finally get this done and do it despite opposition from congressional members of his own party if necessary. To stop public funding is good policy and good politics. The reason is simple. President Lyndon Johnson may have pledged in 1967 that public broadcasting would become a vital public resource to enrich our homes, educate our families, and to provide assistance to our classrooms. But public broadcasting immediately became a liberal forum for public affairs and journalism. Not only is the federal government trillions of dollars in debt and unable to afford the more than $500 million squandered on leftist opinion each year, but the government should not be compelling the conservative half of the country to pay for the suppression of its own views. As Thomas Jefferson put it, to compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagations of opinions which he disbelieves and abhors is sinful and tyrannical. A demonstrated pattern of bias. Conservatives will thus reward a president who eliminates this tyrannical situation. PBS and NPR do not even bother to run programming that would attract conservatives. As Pew Research demonstrated in 2014, 25% of PBS's audience is mostly liberal and 35% is consistently liberal. That is 60% liberal compared to 15% conservative, 11% mostly conservative, and 4% consistently conservative. NPR's audience is even to the left of that, with 67% liberal, 41% consistently liberal, and 26% mostly liberal, compared with 12% conservative, 3% and 9% consistently conservative, and mostly conservative, respectively. That may be an acceptable business model for MSNBC or CNN, but not for a taxpayer-subsidized broadcaster. Defunding through the budgetary process. Cutting off the CPB is logistically easy. The solution lies in the budgetary process. In 2022, the CPB submitted to the Labor, Health and Human Services, Education, and related agencies subcommittees of the House and Senate Appropriations Committees its budget justification for fiscal year, FY 2023. In it, the CPB requested that Congress give it a $565 million advance appropriation, a $40 million increase compared to its FY 2022 funding. Unlike most other agencies, the CPB receives advance appropriations that provide them with funding 2 years ahead of time, which insulates the agency from Congress's power of the purse and oversight. This special budgetary treatment is unjustified and should be ended. The 47th president can just tell the Congress, through the budget he proposes and through personal contact, that he will not sign an appropriations spending bill that contains a penny for the CPB. The president may have to use the bully pulpit as NPR and PBS have teams of lobbyists who have convinced enough members of Congress to save their bacon every time their taxpayer subsidies have been at risk since the Nixon era. Defunding CPB would by no means cause NPR or PBS or other public broadcasters that benefit from CPB funding, including the even further to the left Pacifica Radio and American Public Media, to file for bankruptcy. The membership model that the CPB uses, along with the funding from corporations and foundations that it also receives, would allow these broadcasters to continue to thrive. As George Will wrote, if Sesame Street programming were put up for auction, the danger would be of getting trampled by the stampede of potential bidders. Indeed, Sesame Street is on HBO now, which shows its potential as a money earner. Public interest versus privilege. Stripping public funding would, of course, mean that NPR, PBS, Pacifica Radio, and the other leftist broadcasters would be shorn of the presumption that they act in the public interest and receive the privileges that often accompany so acting. They should no longer, for example, be qualified as non-commercial education stations, NC stations, which they clearly no longer are. NPR, Pacifica, and the other radio ventures have zero claim on an educational function, the original purpose for which they were created by President Johnson. And the percentage of on-air programming that PBS devotes to educational endeavors, such as Sesame Street, programs that are themselves biased to the left, is small. Being an NC comes with benefits. The Federal Communications Commission, for example, reserves the 20 stations at the lower end of the radio frequency, between 88 and 108 MHz on the FM band, for NCs. The FCC says that only non-commercial educational radio stations are licensed in the 88 to 92 MHz reserved band, while both commercial and non-commercial educational stations may operate in the non-reserved band. This confers advantages, as lower frequency stations can be heard farther away and are easier to find as they lie on the left end of the radio dial, figuratively as well as ideologically. The FCC also exempts NC stations from licensing fees. It says that non-commercial educational, NC, FM station licensees and full-service NC television broadcast station licensees are exempt from paying regulatory fees, provided that these stations operate solely on an NC basis. NPR and PBS stations are in reality no longer non-commercial, as they run ads in everything but name for their sponsors. They are also non-educational. The next president should instruct the FCC to exclude the stations affiliated with PBS and NPR from the NC denomination and the privileges that come with it. Chapter 9. Agency for International Development. Mission. The U.S. Agency for International Development leads the U.S. government's international development and disaster assistance programs. USAID helps communities to lead their own development journeys by reducing the impact of conflict, preventing hunger and the spread of pandemic disease, and counteracting the drivers of violence, instability, transnational crime, and other threats. In alignment with U.S. national security interests, the agency promotes American prosperity through initiatives that expand markets for U.S. exports, encourage innovation, create a level playing field for U.S. businesses, and support more stable, resilient, and democratic societies that are less likely to act against American interests and more likely to respect family, life, and religious liberty. Overview. USAID was established during the presidency of John F. Kennedy pursuant to the Foreign Assistance Act of 19,611 to promote the foreign policy, security, and national interests of the United States. At the height of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, it sought to halt the spread of communism by assisting peoples in the developing world in their efforts to advance economically, socially, and politically. The agency helped to transition Central and Eastern Europe from socialism to free market-based democracies. Today, USAID leads the U.S. government's global development and humanitarian disaster assistance responses. Over the years, USAID expanded the number of countries assisted, the scope and size of its activities, and especially its budget. The Trump administration faced an institution marred by bureaucratic inertia, programmatic incoherence, wasteful spending, and dependence on huge awards to a self-serving and politicized aid industrial complex of United Nations agencies, international non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and for-profit contractors. Once started, programs continue almost indefinitely, in many countries, for decades. USAID's multi-billion-dollar humanitarian programs that were once 80% in response to natural disasters are now 80% in response to violent, man-made crises and have become a permanent and immiserating feature of the global landscape. Under the Trump administration, USAID focused on ending the need for foreign aid by placing countries onto a journey to self-reliance. The administration restructured the agency to reflect this strategic approach to development, streamlined procurement procedures to diversify its partner base, increased awards to cost-effective local, including faith-based, organizations, and improved internal governance. It instituted pro-life and family-friendly policies. It promoted international religious freedom as a pillar of the agency's work and built up an unprecedented genocide response infrastructure. The Biden administration has deformed the agency by treating it as a global platform to pursue overseas a divisive political and cultural agenda that promotes abortion, climate extremism, gender radicalism, and interventions against perceived systemic racism. It has dispensed with decades of bipartisan consensus on foreign aid and pursued policies that contravene basic American values and have antagonized our partners in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. It has decoupled U.S. assistance from free market reforms that are the keystone of economic and political stability and has teamed with global institutions to impose central planning diktats on an unprecedented scale. Wasteful budget increases requested by the administration and appropriated by Congress have outstripped USAID's capacity to spend funds responsibly, and U.S. foreign aid has been transformed into a massive and open-ended global entitlement program captured by and enriching the progressive left. The next conservative administration should scale back USAID's global footprint by, at a minimum, returning to the agency's 2019 pre-COVID-19 pandemic budget level. It should de-radicalize USAID's programs and structures and build on the conservative reforms instituted by the Trump administration. This will require working closely with the U.S. Congress to make deep cuts in the international affairs zero account, while granting USAID greater flexibility in spending its appropriated funds to achieve better developmental outcomes. Key issues. Aligning U.S. foreign aid to U.S. foreign policy. U.S. foreign aid is too often disconnected from the strategy and practice of U.S. foreign policy. Its coordination is made difficult as the aid budget is divided among approximately 20 offices, agencies, and departments that provide some form of foreign assistance. The USAID administrator should be authorized to take on the additional role of Director of Foreign Assistance, DFA, with the rank of Deputy Secretary at the Department of State in charge of all U.S. foreign assistance. The DFA role would empower this person to align and coordinate the countless foreign assistance programs across the U.S. government and carry out the agenda of the next conservative president more effectively. A version of this role existed during the last 2 years of the George W. Bush administration, but the Obama administration eliminated it in 2009. Countering China's development challenge. Through its $1 trillion Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, the People's Republic of China, PRC, has directed billions of dollars in loans and investments to advance its geostrategic objective of displacing the United States as the premier global power. The PRC leverages its transactions, termed debt traps by many critics, to strengthen its global influence, extract natural resources, isolate Taiwan, win political support at international fora, and access ports and bases for its military. In Latin America, 25 of 29 countries participate in the BRI, and the PRC ranks as the region's largest trading partner. Since 2005, Chinese state-owned banks have issued $138 billion in loans to Latin American countries, and other Chinese entities have invested an additional $140 billion. In Africa, China has issued $160 billion in loans and dominates the continent's rare earth mining sector, which is critical to global energy development. The World Bank estimates that 60% of all BRI loans are in financial distress, leading many countries to seek emergency financial help from Western donors. Additional $140 billion. In Africa, China has issued $160 billion in loans and dominates the continent's rare earth mining sector, which is critical to global energy development. The World Bank estimates that 60% of all BRI loans are in financial distress, leading many countries to seek emergency financial help from Western donors. Chinese-funded projects are known for employing substandard labor and environmental practices, fueling corruption, promoting wasteful financial decisions by governments, advancing China's geostrategic interests, and creating an unequal trade relationship in which China secures raw materials from developing countries and sells those countries' manufacturing products. For example, Brazil, a world leader in shoe production, saw its industry collapse under a flood of cheap Chinese imports. China's mercantilist penetration of the developing world and the negative consequences for developing countries' healthy economic growth have undercut U.S. strategic relationships in those countries and wasted billions in U.S. foreign aid. During the Trump administration, USAID inaugurated a robust counter-China response called Clear Choice that contrasted America's development approach based on liberty, sovereignty, and free markets with China's mercantilist authoritarianism that pursued predatory financing schemes and economic and political subordination to Beijing. Launched its first digital strategy to promote safe 5G access in emerging markets and combat Beijing's efforts to equip regimes with tools to stifle democracy. Struck bilateral development relationships with Japan, Israel, Kuwait, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Taiwan to support projects in sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. Established an office in Greenland to help counter China's claims of being a near-Arctic state, and being a near-Arctic state, and reoriented its programming across Asia, including establishing a USAID mission to Central Asia, in line with America's Indo-Pacific strategy. Joined with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration to help coastal countries detect and halt illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing and confront criminal activities practiced by state-run Chinese fishing fleets that violate international norms, ravage fishing. Industries in developing countries worsen food insecurity, rob vulnerable communities of their livelihoods, and deplete maritime resources. USAID built an organizational infrastructure to carry out its multiple lines of counter-China operations. An agency-wide Clear Choice Executive Council and USAID, UDITS, International Development Finance Corporation Working Group reviewed all proposed assistance programs and proposals through a counter-China lens. A senior executive-level Clear Choice coordinator, reporting to the administrator, advised the agency's leadership on initiatives to counter China, supported by a fully dedicated 6-person secretariat. The Biden administration discontinued these programs and allowed USAID's counter-China architecture to waste away, subordinating our national security interests to progressive climate politics in which communist China is viewed as a global partner. The next conservative administration should restore and build on the Trump administration's counter-China infrastructure at USAID, end the climate policy fanaticism that advantages Beijing, and assess bilateral aid through the lens of U.S. national security interests, rewarding those countries that resist China's debt diplomacy. It should finance programs designed to counter specific Chinese efforts in strategically important countries and eliminate funding to any partner that engages with Chinese entities directly or indirectly. USAID's Bangkok-based Regional Development Mission for Asia should focus its strategic attention on supporting cross-border initiatives designed to counter Chinese influence. Climate change. IVs designed to counter Chinese influence. Climate change. Upon taking office, President Biden issued executive orders to put the climate crisis at the center of U.S. foreign policy and national security and mitigate the devastating inequalities that intersect with gender, race, ethnicity, and economic security. USAID subsequently declared itself a climate agency and redirected its private sector engagement strategy, teaming with America's corporate sector to wean countries off foreign aid through private investment and trade, to support the administration's global policy to transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. The administration has incorporated its radical climate policy into every USAID initiative. It has joined or funded international partnerships dedicated to advancing the aims of the Paris Climate Agreement and has supported the idea of giving trillions of dollars more in aid transfers for climate reparations. The Biden administration's extreme climate policies have worsened global food insecurity and hunger. Its anti-fossil fuel agenda has led to a sharp spike in global energy prices. Inflation has hit the poor the hardest as they expend a higher proportion of income on food purchases. Farmers in poor countries can no longer afford to buy expensive natural gas-based fertilizers that are key to achieving high yields of food production. Under advice from climate radicals, the government of Sri Lanka even banned chemical fertilizers entirely without having any replacements in place. The result has been hunger and violent political instability. The aid industry claims that climate change causes poverty, which is false. Enduring conflict, government corruption, and bad economic policies are the main drivers of global poverty. USAID's response to man-made food insecurity is to provide more billions of dollars in aid, a recipe that will keep scores of poor countries underdeveloped and dependent on foreign aid for years to come. The impact on Africa is especially acute. South Africa, for example, relies on coal-powered plants to generate 80% of its power needs. IGN aid to make the full transition away from coal. Multiplying this amount by dozens of other countries on the continent, the financial resources needed to transition away from fossil fuels are unachievable. In Latin America, countries that are global leaders in oil and gas production have sharply curtailed their energy production in line with climate activists, upending the hemisphere's major source of export revenues and condemning it to years of economic and political instability. USAID should cease its war on fossil fuels in the developing world and support the responsible management of oil and gas reserves as the quickest way to end wrenching poverty and the need for open-ended foreign aid. The next conservative administration should rescind all climate policies from its foreign aid programs, specifically USAID's Climate Strategy 2022 to 20,307, shut down the agency's offices, programs, and directives designed to advance the Paris Climate Agreement, and narrowly limit funding to traditional climate mitigation efforts. USAID resources are best deployed to strengthen the resilience of countries that are most vulnerable to climatic shifts. The agency should cease collaborating with and funding progressive foundations, corporations, international institutions, and NGOs that advocate on behalf of climate fanaticism. Diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda. USAID installed advisors on diversity, equity, and inclusion, DI committees in all its bureaus, offices, and overseas missions, and created an agency-wide dashboard and DI scorecard for all bureaus, offices, and missions to track staff compliance with the administration's DI directives. A chief DI officer oversees this DI infrastructure and sits in the administrator's office. DI directives are now part of all agency policies and are incorporated as standard clauses in all contract and grant awards. Those seeking to do business with the agency must describe the approaches they will use to diversify their partner base. USAID often ties DI to gender and climate equity, corrupting every aspect of the agency's overseas work. as standard clauses in all contract and grant awards. Those seeking to do business with the agency must describe the approaches they will use to diversify their partner base. USAID often ties DEI to gender and climate equity, corrupting every aspect of the agency's overseas work. The upshot has been to racialize the agency and create a hostile work environment for anyone who disagrees with the Biden administration's identity politics. This pursuit of ideological purity threatens merit-based professional advancement for staff who do not overtly conform, hyper-politicizes what should be a nonpartisan federal workplace environment, creates an institutionalized cadre of progressive political commissars, corrupts the award process, and discourages potential contractors and grantees that disagree with this radical agenda from applying for USAID funding. The next conservative administration should dismantle USAID's DI apparatus by eliminating the Chief Diversity Officer position along with the DI advisors and committees, cancel the DI scorecard and dashboard, remove DI requirements from contract and grant tenders and awards, issue a directive to cease promotion of the DI agenda, including the bullying LGBTQ+ agenda, and provide staff a confidential medium through which to adjudicate cases of political retaliation that agency or implementing staff suffered during the Biden administration. It should eliminate funding for partners that promote discriminatory DI practices and consider debarment in egregious cases. As federal departments and agencies cannot play partisan politics, staff, irrespective of hiring mechanism, as well as implementers and grantees that engage in ideological agitation on behalf of the DI agenda should be dismissed, and entities should be debarred. The next conservative administration should return the authority over all civil rights issues at USAID to the agency's Office of Civil Rights, which is the appropriate locus for ensuring that all Americans have guaranteed equality of career opportunity at USAID, refocusing gender equality on women, children, and families. Instead of protecting women's and children's unalienable human rights and propelling their ability to thrive in society, past Democrat administrations have nearly erased what females are and what femininity is through gender, policies, and practices. For instance, these administrations have diluted USAID's focus on assisting vulnerable women, children, and families around the globe by adding protections for and ideological advocacy on behalf of progressive special interest groups. USAID now aggressively promotes abortion on demand under the guise of sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights, gender equality, and women's empowerment, and advocates for those who claim minority status or vulnerability. Families are the basic unit of and foundation for a thriving society. Without women, there are no children, and society cannot continue. As evidenced by the confirmation testimony of now Associate Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, the progressive left has so misused and altered the definition of what a woman is that one of our U.S. Supreme Court justices was unable to delineate clearly the fundamental biological and sexual traits that define the group of which she is a part. USAID cannot advocate for and protect women when they have been erased globally along with the values and traditional structures that have supported them. The next conservative administration should rename the USAID Office of Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment, GEW, as the USAID Office of Women, Children, and Families. Refocus and realign resources that currently support programs in GEW to the Office of Women, Children, and Families. Redesignate the Senior Gender Coordinator as an unapologetically pro-life, politically appointed Senior Coordinator of the Office of Women, Children, and Families, and eliminate the more than 180 gender advisors and points of contact embedded in missions and operating units throughout the agency. In addition, the next conservative administration should rescind President Biden's 2022 gender policy and refocus it on women, children, and families and revise the agency's regulation on integrating gender equality and female empowerment in USAID's program cycle. It should remove all references, examples, definitions, photos, and language on USAID websites, in agency publications and policies, and in all agency contracts and grants that include the following terms: gender, gender equality, gender equity, gender diverse individuals, gender aware, gender sensitive, etc. It should also remove references to abortion, reproductive health, and sexual and reproductive rights, and controversial sexual education materials. In the past, the word gender was a polite alternative to the word sex or term biological sex. The left has commandeered the term gender, which used to mean either male or female, to include a spectrum of others who are seeking to alter biological and societal sexual norms. The promotion of gender radicalism is anathema to the traditional norms of many societies where USAID works, causes resentment by tying life-saving assistance to rejecting the aid recipient's own firmly held fundamental values regarding sexuality, and produces unnecessary consternation and confusion among, and even outright bias against men. The next administration should ensure that USAID's goal in service of its mission is to help protect and propel all members of society, women, children, and men, from conception to natural death. To do so, USAID's Office of Women, Children, and Families should strive to ensure that communities have their basic human needs, without which they will be unable to thrive, met first and foremost. Basic human needs include equal and safe access to potable water, sanitation, food, education, healthcare, houses of worship, justice, pregnancy and family resource centers, working capital, electricity, technology, and business opportunities. The Office of Women, Children, and Families should implement the Geneva Consensus Declaration on Women's Health and Protection of the Family and prioritize partnerships with local organizations, including faith-based organizations, FBOs. Protecting life and foreign assistance. Protecting life should be among the core objectives of United States foreign assistance. Shortly after taking office, however, President Biden issued a memorandum that reversed a myriad of pro-life policies and revoked the Protecting Life in Global Health Assistance, PLGCHA, policy, widely known as the Mexico City policy. Biden also restored funding to the United Nations Population Fund, UNFPA, which supports and implements China's coercive abortion and sterilization regimen. PLGCHA requires foreign NGOs, as a condition of receiving assistance, to agree not to perform or actively promote abortions as a method of family planning in foreign countries. Previous pro-life presidents, beginning with Ronald Reagan, applied these conditions to family planning assistance, but President Trump for the first time expanded the Mexico City policy to protect global health assistance furnished by all departments or agencies, estimated to be $8.8 billion annually. The Biden administration restored abortion subsidies to pro-abortion NGOs, including Planned Parenthood International and MSI Reproductive Choices. In reversing PLGCHA, Biden declared a radical assault on the policy of protecting life, choosing instead to promote abortion on demand around the world under the guise of sexual and reproductive health and rights. USAID's priority of funding the global abortion industry negates programs that promote life, women's health, and the family. Even under PLGCHA, several loopholes allowed support for the global abortion industry to continue. International NGOs that perform and promote abortions overseas, like Population Services International, Pathfinder, PATH, the Population Council in Gender Health, and WomanCare Global International, continued to receive funding from USAID under PLGCHA and now, under Biden, receive tens of millions more in U.S. taxpayer dollars in foreign assistance annually without any oversight. When the United Nations Secretariat promoted abortion and abortion-inducing drugs under the umbrella of sexual and reproductive health as an element of its COVID-19 Global Humanitarian Response Plan in May 2020, the exemptions in PLGCHA for humanitarian aid and multilateral organizations illuminated another loophole in the policy's effectiveness in safeguarding U.S. taxpayer dollars from being used to promote abortion. Pro-abortion groups also have received funds under other categories of foreign aid that fall outside the scope of global health assistance, including women-related and economic assistance programs. Members of Congress have advocated closing these loopholes by extending PLGCHA to all foreign assistance through the Protecting Life in Foreign Assistance Act, sponsored by Senator Mike Lee, Republican Utah, and Representative Virginia Foxx, Republican North Carolina. Current law in the Foreign Assistance Act gives the President broad authority to set such terms and conditions as he may determine on foreign assistance, which legally empowers the next conservative president to expand this pro-life policy. To stop U.S. foreign aid from supporting the global abortion industry, the next conservative administration should issue an executive order that, at a minimum, reinstates PLGCHA and summarily blocks funding to UNFPA, but also closes loopholes by applying the policy to all foreign assistance, including humanitarian aid, and improving its enforcement. The executive order to reinstate PLGCHA should be drafted broadly to apply to all foreign assistance. It should simultaneously rescind President Biden's memorandum entitled Protecting Women's Health at Home and Abroad, issued on January 28, 2021. The new pro-life executive order should apply to foreign NGOs, including subgrantees and subcontractors, and remove exemptions for U.S.-based NGOs, public international organizations, and bilateral government-to-government agreements. All entities funded by USAID, both directly and indirectly, should report their compliance with the PLGCHA, and USAID should institute penalties, including debarment from future federal funding, for violations of it. The new executive order also should instruct the administrator of USAID to publish reports on implementation of the PLGCHA by both prime and subprime recipients. In addition, the Helms Amendment should continue to be applied, as it has been by both Republican and Democratic administrations for more than 50 years, as a complete ban on the use of taxpayer dollars to pay for abortions abroad. International religious freedom. Conservatives believe international religious freedom is central to USAID's development efforts. President Trump's Executive Order 13926 on advancing international religious freedom instructed the Secretary of State, in consultation with the USAID administrator, to budget at least $50 million a year for programs that advance international religious freedom and ensure that faith-based and religious entities, including eligible entities in foreign countries, are not discriminated against on the basis of religious identity or religious belief when competing for federal funding. Under the Trump administration, the agency set up a senior-level chief advisor for international religious freedom who reported directly to the administrator with the task of coordinating a whole-of-USAID approach to achieving this priority. It created a robust genocide response capability. USAID affirmed the agency's partnerships with faith-based organizations through its rule on participation by religious organizations in USAID programs, partnership guidance and answers to frequently asked questions, FAQs, for faith-based organizations, and legal guidance and answers to FAQs for USAID staff. Today, USAID officials and their progressive partners have resisted efforts to promote religious freedom, especially as it relates to abortion and gender ideology, which are anathema to the traditional societies where USAID funds programs, in addition to many U.S. taxpayers. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken repudiated his predecessor's focus on religious freedom. The next conservative administration must champion the core American value of religious freedom, which correlates significantly with poverty reduction, economic growth, and peace. It should train all USAID staff on the connection between religious freedom and development, integrated into all of the agency's programs, including the 5-year country development and coordination strategies due for updates in 2025, strengthen the mission's relationships with local faith-based leaders, and build on local programs that are serving the poor. Congress should appropriate funding to USAID specifically to support persecuted religious minorities in line with Executive Order 13926, streamlining procurement and localizing the partner base. USAID is a grant-making and contracting agency that disperses billions of dollars of federal funding in developing countries through implementing partners, such as UN agencies, international NGOs, for-profit companies, and local non-governmental entities. In rare instances, such as in Jordan and Ukraine, the agency provides direct budget support to finance the operations of host country governments. USAID far more often counts on expensive and ineffective large contracts and grants to carry out its programs. It justifies these practices based on speed and a lower administrative burden on its institutional capacity. Partnering and procurement reform was a pillar of the Trump administration's effort to secure better development results, cut costs, and advance the journey to self-reliant strategy of exiting countries from aid. In December 2018, USAID launched its first acquisition and assistance strategy to streamline procurement processes, introduce innovation into its programming, and diversify its partner base away from large, expensive, and partisan implementers. The strategy counted on local NGOs, including faith-based entities already on the ground, to provide the agency with less costly and more effective alternatives to the aid giants. The strategy also prioritized global partnerships with the private sector, corporations, investors, diasporas, and private philanthropies, the source of real capital investment, innovation, and efficiencies that can maximize the impact of taxpayer dollars. Under the Biden administration, despite rhetoric to the contrary, the aid industrial complex has recaptured the agency and stifled further reforms. The next conservative administration should immediately implement language on key policy topics as standard provisions in all grants, cooperative agreements, and contracts. These provisions should include language on implementing the policy on protecting life in foreign assistance, imposing conditions on funding to multilateral organizations, and increasing accountability and transparency. To ensure that USAID exercises its existing authorities to streamline procurement processes, the next conservative administration should name a political appointee as the agency's senior procurement executive and director of the agency's Office of Assistance and Acquisitions, OA, in the Bureau of Management, M. The head of M/OA is one of the most important positions at USAID, as the office is ground zero for controlling the disbursement of U.S. foreign aid. The White House should empower the administrator and his or her designees to make determinations concerning the scale and scope of awards and increase the transparency and accountability of subawards, which can escape public scrutiny and promote progressive policies during conservative administrations. USAID should use existing authority to use program funds to expand its roster of contracting and agreement officers to accelerate the delivery of funds for disaster responses to a more diverse collection of implementers. Accomplishing the next conservative administration's policy goals at USAID will require that political appointees have knowledge of, responsibility for, and visibility into the design and awarding of grants, contracts, and cooperative agreements. The administration should restore the Senior Official Accountability Review, SOR, or create a similar process to ensure that proposed programs above a certain dollar threshold in total estimated cost/total estimated amount receive a close review by policymakers in each bureau and office and, for large awards, in the agency's front office. Localization is a buzzword within the aid community, but correctly assumes that more funding through local organizations produces better aid outcomes. Shifting from giant US-based implementers has proved difficult to achieve, however, given intense internal bureaucratic resistance, opposition from the aid industrial complex, and foot-dragging from progressives who view local NGOs, especially faith-based NGOs prominent in Africa and Latin America, as obstacles to promoting abortion, gender radicalism, climate extremism, and other woke ideas. The President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, has shown that localization at scale is possible within a short time span. Over the 4 years of the Trump administration, the multi-billion-dollar program increased the amount of funding dispersed to local entities from about 25% to nearly 70% with positive overall results. This model should be replicated across all of USAID. In addition, the next conservative administration should expand use of the new Partnership Initiative, NPI, to every bureau and office, reset the requirements for USAID's overseas missions to craft and execute NPI action plans, and assign each mission a minimum percentage of its portfolio that must go to new, underutilized, and local partners. Crucial to the strategy will be increasing the use of open competition that lowers barriers to entry and fixed amount awards that carry less of a compliance burden, along with eliminating cost-plus reimbursement contracts that favor large companies. Before advancing a new program, the agency should be required to assess existing local activities to avoid undercutting or duplicating them. At every opportunity, USAID should build on existing local initiatives. Global health. The United States is the world's largest funder of global health initiatives. For more than 60 years, the American people have offered health assistance to the world and saved millions of lives. The USAID Bureau for Global Health, GH, the second largest within USAID, oversees a multi-billion-dollar operation to support maternal and child health, voluntary family planning, PEPFAR, and the President's Malaria Initiative, PMI, both started under President George W. Bush, and other initiatives against other infectious and neglected tropical diseases. Effective use of funds is essential to maximize care for the world's neediest people. Countries with strong health institutions and sound public health practices responded quickly to and recovered more rapidly from the COVID-19 pandemic. This demonstrates the importance of localization, by which USAID helps governments and the private sector in developing countries to strengthen their own ability to address needed training, services, accountability, and organizational capacity. Unfortunately, many USAID-funded global health activities remain rooted in patterns that began decades ago and measure improvements in terms of inputs, money spent, instead of outcomes achieved. From the 1950s to 1970s, the major recognized threats to human health were infectious diseases such as polio and smallpox, and USAID funded programs in a country, not with a country. Maternal and child health, food, water, and sanitation programs were often intermittent. USAID consistently financed population control, contraception, and abortion as essential to development. Most programs focused on one disease or condition, but had little integration with other global health activities. Chronic diseases were ignored. Consequently, the next conservative administration should focus on updating the Global Health Bureau's portfolio, emphasizing a comprehensive approach to supporting women, children, and families, building host country institutional capacity, increasing awards to local and faith-based partners, expanding what occurred during the Trump administration with the NPI, and improving USAID's ability to coordinate with local partners. Updating funding priorities. The Bureau should identify and eliminate outdated and ineffective concepts and focus on funding innovation. A rigorous review is necessary to ensure that current programs and funding streams avoid wasting taxpayer dollars and prioritize what is needed now and what works, focusing on holistic healthcare and support for women, children, and families. The continued high rate of maternal and infant mortality is a persistent global tragedy. Contrary to current publicity, this problem is not solved by abortion. Families genuinely cherish children. The next leadership at USAID must focus attention on women and children's health, including unborn children, as well as health risks across lifespans, including childhood infections, cervical cancer, adolescent risks, and family stability. By utilizing a coordinated approach, the Bureau should implement a request for application for resilient families that harvests collaborative funds from siloed programs and makes individuals and the family, not diseases or conditions, the true focus of intervention. Increasing USAID collaboration with faith-based organizations. FBOs historically have been much more successful in outreach to remote and vulnerable populations based on trust built through decades of service. The value of collaborating with FBOs was demonstrated in the October 2020 Evidence Summit on Religious Engagement. In sub-Saharan Africa, FBOs often provide more than 80% of healthcare, especially to the extremely poor. In contrast, the Global Health Bureau historically has provided 85% of its funding to large U.S. NGOs with significant overhead costs, as a result of which only 20%, 30% of funding reaches people in need. Leveraging the strength and experience of presidential initiatives. Millions of people are alive today because of the American people's investment in PEPFAR and PMI. The training, laboratory, clinical intervention, health education, data collection, and organizational platforms of these programs became the bedrock for responding to the COVID pandemic. It is time for these programs to become part of an integrated, strong, and sustainable network of healthcare and public health in developing countries. A smooth transition to national ownership and funding, however, will require better coordination of USAID's own stovepiped programs with PEPFAR and PMI, strengthening the collection and use of data. Good decisions are based on accurate data. For decades, global health programs have relied mostly on statistical modeling, rather than actual data, or survey data, the weakest type of data. Poor data quality undermines both the evaluation and improvement of desired outcomes achieved by our global health programs. The Trump administration implemented critical updates of PEPFAR systems for the collection and reporting of data to increase transparency and hold funded partners and overseas missions accountable. The next conservative administration should apply these reforms to all of USAID's global health programs. Strengthening private sector engagement. The Bureau Center for Innovation and Impact, CII, should be empowered to expand networks of private and faith-based health organizations that can develop projects using development impact bonds, capital funds, and innovative technologies, including with the Millennium Challenge Corporation and the new U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. More flexible and agile CII funding will spur innovation within the Bureau and help to enhance countries' self-reliance in the provision of healthcare, improving Bureau hiring, staffing, and recruitment practices. The Global Health Bureau should address its own management challenges by modifying the high ratio of contractors to direct hires, holding career leadership accountable for effective management, and building more flexibility in emergency responses. Bureau personnel suffer from mission drift, burnout, and a lack of vision. New directives, social agendas, and extra layers of review have obscured core activities and caused talent to leave the agency. Conservative leadership must return the focus to development and improved workforce morale and focus on global outcomes and the efficient use of taxpayer dollars. Holding the UN, the World Health Organization, WHO, and other multilateral organizations accountable. Leadership should designate a political appointee to help coordinate cross-agency efforts to hold the U.S. government's multilateral partners, UN, and WHO agencies and other international organizations, to a higher level of financial and programmatic accountability, including assurances that language promoting abortion will be removed from UN documents, policy statements, and technical literature. The United States must have more prominent representation in international technical committees and regulation-setting organizations to ensure the proper execution of American resources, the preservation of our values, the protection of innovation, and the vitality of our biomedical sector. Global humanitarian assistance. End Hour 9. Start Hour 10. The U.S. government is the world's largest humanitarian actor, annually dispersing billions of dollars in life-saving assistance, food, water, shelter, emergency health care, and related protection support to tens of millions of vulnerable people. Funded by the U.S. Congress through the International Disaster Assistance, IDA, account, USAID pays for nearly half of the budget of the Nobel Prize-winning UN World Food Program, WFP, as well as dozens of simultaneous operations that range from responses to hurricanes in Central America to tackling outbreaks of Ebola in Central Africa and caring for millions of people displaced by ongoing conflicts. USAID's emergency responses once were focused primarily on natural cataclysms such as hurricanes, floods, and earthquakes. Today, the agency spends more than 80% of its humanitarian budget on chronic man-made crises. Most of these emergency responses began years ago and absorb billions of dollars annually with no end in sight. Every year sees financial demands grow in response to new conflicts, most recently Ukraine. The budget of the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, BCHA, has doubled compared to just a few years ago, and BCHA can no longer manage its funds responsibly. A politically powerful foreign aid industry that benefits financially from extending and expanding these large-scale programs for years, even decades, ensures little scrutiny of these ever-increasing appropriations. The massive growth in emergency aid distorts humanitarian responses, worsens corruption in the countries we support, and exacerbates the misery of those we intend to help. The permanence of this assistance, particularly in countries where we have little to no in-country presence and